Good morning. Today we are going to deal with The Color Purple, the novel written by Alice Walker. I had asked you to read the novel, I think, in the month of December after your exams are over. So I hope you have read the novel. So we'll just discuss a little bit about that novel, some important topics with regard to the novel The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Taking into consideration the fact that you have read the novel and you're going to kind of follow what I'm going to speak regarding this. So when we talk about Alice Walker, we know her as a black woman writer who propounded the term womanist. We'll come to that later on. So she was born in the USA in a place called Georgia. And she is one writer whose novels, whose short stories, and whose poems are very much noted for the insightful treatment of the African American culture. And the particular novel that you have to study, The Color Purple, which was published in 1982, focuses particularly on women. So Alice Walker was born into a family of sharecroppers, African American sharecroppers, and she was the eighth child. And during her childhood, she was accidentally blinded in one eye when her brother accidentally turned a gun on. So because she was blinded in one eye, her mother did not make her do any household chores. Instead, her mother gave her a typewriter, which allowed her to write. So she was a good student and she received a scholarship to attend Spelman College, and she studied there for 2 years, and later on she won a scholarship to Sarah Lawrence College in New York. She graduated in 1965 and later she moved to Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, because Mississippi was, the state of Mississippi was well known for the involvement in the civil rights movement, and she got involved in the civil rights movement. She also began teaching and publishing short stories and essays. She got married in 1967 but divorced in 1976. So that's a little bit about her personal life. Her first book was a book of poetry. It was titled Once, and it was published in 1968. And in 1970, she published her first novel titled The Third Life of Grange Copeland. So that is a novel. It's just something that spans over 3 generations, around 60 years. And so it is a narrative, and it is something that speaks about 3 generations of people, right? Then I think in 1972 she published the second book of poetry titled Revolutionary Petunias and Other Poems, and also in 1972 she published her first collection of short stories, In Love and Trouble: Stories of Black Women. So this particular collection of short stories bears witness to the sexist violence and abuse in the African American community. Now, after moving to New York in 1976, Walker wrote the novel Meridian. Now, Meridian deals with the lives of several civil rights workers in the 1960s. Later on, she moved to California, and in 1982, it was in California that she published her most popular novel, which you have to study, The Color Purple. So this is an epistolary novel, and it depicts the growing up and the self-realization of an African American woman between the early 90s to the mid 90s. That is, early 1900s to the mid 1900s. So it's, I think, around 1910 to 1950. Celie, the main character Celie, and Alice Walker speaks about her growing up in a small town called Georgia. Now, this book, The Color Purple, won the Pulitzer Prize for her. It was later adapted into a movie by Steven Spielberg in 1985. You can watch that. And Quincy Jones and Oprah Winfrey also produced a musical version of the same story, which was premiered in 2004. Later on, Alice Walker went on to write the novel titled The Temple of My Familiar, which is an ambitious examination of racial and sexual tensions. It was published in 1989. In 1992, she wrote a narrative centered on female genital mutilation, which is titled Possessing the Secret of Joy. And in 1998, she wrote a novel titled By the Light of My Father's Smile. This is a story of a family of anthropologists who pretend to be missionaries because they want to gain access to a Mexican tribe. In 2005, she published a novel titled Now is the Time to Open Your Heart. It is about an older woman's quest for identity. So there are many critical reviews about these novels, and many of these critical reviewers complain that she did not conceive her characters well, and the characters and the abstractions used in the novel are not very good, they're very poor. But Walker continued to draw praise for championing racial and gender equality in her work. And she released the volume of short stories titled The Way Forward is with a Broken Heart in 2000, and several other volumes of poetry, including one, Absolute Trust in the Goodness of the Earth, a poem, Travel Down My Arm, Hard Times Require Furious Dancing, Taking the Arrow Out of the Heart, her blue body, everything we know, earthling poems. So she actually published a lot of poetry collections like this from 1965 to 1990. She also has written essays, and most of her essays were compiled in the collection in the anthology In Search of Her Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose, which was published in 1983. Sent by Earth, a message from the grandmother's spirit after the bombing of the World Trade Center at Penton in 2001. We are the ones we have been waiting for 2006. And the cushion in the road, meditation and wandering as the whole world awakens to being in harm's way, 2013. So she has written juvenile fiction, critical essays on female writers like Flannery O'Connor, Zora Neale Hurston, etc. And I think in 2011, she wrote a memoir. It's very unconventional, titled The Chicken Chronicles. And she discusses about caring for a flock of chickens while also musing on her life. And her documentary, Alice Walker, Beauty and Truth, was released in 2013. So that is a little bit about Alice Walker for you. And what we have to study is the novel titled The Color Purple. It's a very, very interesting novel, published in 1982. It's about a black woman named Celie, and it's very interesting. So when we look at the plot, we know that Celie is if you have read the novel, Celie is the protagonist. She's the narrator of The Color Purple. She is a very poor, uneducated 14-year-old black girl who lives in rural Georgia. Now, Celie starts, when you see Dear God, that's how she starts, Dear God. She starts writing letters to God because her father, Alfonso, beats her, rapes her, right? So Alfonso has already impregnated Celie once, and Celie has given birth to a girl whom this man, Alfonso, stole and presumably killed in the woods. So Celie doesn't get to see her child. She's impregnated by her own father, and when she gives birth to a girl, the baby is taken away by the father. And the father tells her that the baby is killed. And then again he rapes her. And again she has a baby, that's a baby boy, and the father steals that baby also. And it's all the time, this is happening when Celie's mother is alive, right? So Celie's mother becomes very ill. She hears of all this and she understands that her husband is doing this to her own daughter. She becomes very ill and she dies. And then when she dies, Alfonso brings a new wife home. And again, even when he brings a new wife, he continues to abuse Celie. So Celie's got a younger sister. She's very bright, pretty. Her name is Nettie. And Celie and Nettie, they learn that there's a man named, see how Celie addresses this man. It's an epistle. She's writing all these letters to God, right? It's an epistolary novel. And this man is mentioned as Mr. Dash, right? Mr. Dash. And they come to understand that Mr. Dash wants to marry Nettie. But Mr. Dash also has a lover named Sugar Avery. She is a singer. And when Celie sees the photograph of Sugar Avery, she's fascinated by this girl, Sugar Avery, right? And Alfonso does not allow Nettie to marry Mr. Dash. Instead, he tells Mr. Dash, you take the ugly Celie as a bride. So that's how he addresses Celie, ugly Celie. That is the adjective he uses for her. And Mr. Dash eventually he accepts the offer. He takes Celie into a very difficult and a very joyless married life. And Nettie has enough. So she runs away from Alfonso and she takes refuge at Celie's house. So Mr. Dash always desired Nettie. And when Nettie comes and lives with them, he makes advances towards her and she flees for her own safety. And Celie never hears from Nettie again for some time, and she assumes that Nettie is dead. And Mr. Dash ill-treats Celie. He is not at all loving towards her. He uses her, he mistreats her, he abuses her, assaults her. And Mr. Dash's sister Kate, uh, she feels so sorry for Celie and she tells her, why do you submit to my brother's abuses? Why don't you fight back against him? That's what Kate tells Celie, right? And Mr. Dash also has a son. His name is Harpo. And he falls in love with a very large, spunky girl named Sophia. And it is then that Sugar Avery comes to town to sing at a local bar, but Celie is not allowed to go and see her. And Sophia and Harpo get married, and Sophia becomes pregnant. And Celie is amazed to see how Sophia defies Harpo, right? Mr. Dash and Harpo try to treat Sophia as an inferior person. They try to abuse her like the way they've abused Celie. But Celie is amazed to see how Sophia resists all that, how she stands up for herself, how she exhibits resilience. And Harpo tries to beat Sophia into submission. But Sophia is a very large, spunky girl, right? And this attempt of Harpo to beat Sophia into submission consistently fails because Sophia is by far the physically stronger of the two. And it is at that time that Sugar Avery falls ill and Mr. Dash brings her into his house. So Sugar is initially very rude to Celie, but Celie takes care of her and the two become very good friends. The two women, they become very good friends and Celie takes charge of nursing Sugar Avery back to life. And here we see a homosexual relationship developing between Celie and Sugar. Because Celie finds herself very much infatuated with Sugar and she gets attracted to her sexually and she is very much sex starved because Mr. Dash does not treat her well, right? So they have a kind of homosexual relationship. And on the other side, we see Harpo's attempts to subordinate Sophia fail. And Sophia gets so frustrated and she moves out. She takes the children with her, she moves out. And Harpo joins after some months, Harpo joins a joint where Sugar Avery sings during the night. And Celie becomes very confused over feelings towards Sugar. She doesn't know, what is the kind of feeling. She has some kind of sexual attraction towards Sugar. And Sugar comes to know that Mr. Dash beats Celie when Sugar is away. So that happens when Sugar is away, right? So Sugar realizes that Mr. Dash is ill-treating Celie and she takes a decision to come and stay there with Celie. And it is then that their relationship grows really intimate. Sugar begins to ask Celie questions about sex and they start a homosexual relationship. And in the meantime, Harpo has taken a new girlfriend named Squeak and her name is Squeak, 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 right? And Sophia once returns for a visit and she gets into a fight with Squeak. And Sophia is a very strong girl. She's a black girl, but very strong. So one day she's walking through the town. The mayor's wife, her name is Mrs. Millie, she asks Sophia to work as her maid. And Sophia says, hell no. She's like very, very strong. She says, of course not, I will not work for you as a maid. And the mayor slaps Sophia for her insubordination because, see, the mayor was white and a black girl answering back to his wife like that was something which he could not take. So he gives her a tight slap for her insubordination. And but Sophia is not a person who takes things lying down. What does she do? She returns the blow. She knocks the mayor down, and because of that, she is sent to jail. And Squeak tries to get Sophia free from jail because Squeak is also kind of tired with Harpo, and she tries to bond with Sophia, and she tries to get Sophia free, but unfortunately, all of Squeak's attempts prove to be futile. And Sophia is sentenced to work for 12 years as the mayor's maid. Because see how the black women were treated. They had double, you can say it was a kind of double marginalization. Because one side they were kind of suppressed by their own black men, and on the other side from the whites. So it was a kind of double marginalization for women from the whites and also from their own men. And in the meantime, Sugar gets married. She has a new husband named Grady. But in spite of her marriage, there is a kind of sexual relationship between Sugar and Celie, and both of them share a sexual relationship. And one night, Sugar asks Celie about Nettie, about her sister Nettie, and Celie tells her Nettie is dead because Nettie had promised to, when she ran away, she had promised to write to Celie, but she never did. And Sugar tells her a secret that time. Sugar tells her, see, I have seen Mr. Dash hide away numerous mysterious letters that have arrived in the mail. And Sugar manages to get her hands on one of these letters, and they find it is from Nettie. Now, both of them search through Mr. Dash's trunk, and Celie and Sugar find dozens of letters that Nettie had sent to Celie over the years, right? And Mr. Dash had been hiding it from Celie. And Celie is overcome with emotion. She reads all the letters in order. She's kind of so angry with Mr. Dash, and she wonders how she's going to keep herself from killing Mr. Dash. Now, in these letters, Nettie tells Celie how she had befriended a missionary couple named Samuel and Corinne, and how she had traveled with them to Africa to do missionary work. Now, Samuel and Corinne have two adopted children, Olivia and Adam. And Nettie and Corinne become very close friends. But Corinne, noticing that her adopted children resemble Nettie, wonders if Nettie and Samuel have a sacred past. So she becomes increasingly suspicious. That is, Corinne, though she's very close to Nettie, she notices that the two adopted children have a close resemblance to Nettie. She wonders, did Nettie and Samuel have some past affair? So she becomes very suspicious of Nettie, and she tries to limit Nettie's role within the family. So Nettie becomes very disillusioned with her missionary experience because she finds the Africans very self-centered and obstinate. And Corinne becomes ill in Africa. She becomes ill. She gets a fever. She becomes ill. And Nettie asks Samuel to tell her how he had adopted Olivia and Adam, because Nettie also wonders what is this resemblance. And when Samuel tells the story of the adoption of Olivia and Adam, Nettie realizes that the two children, Olivia and Adam, whom Samuel and Corinne had adopted, were actually the two children which had been born to Celie from Alfonso. Alfonso had not killed the children, a boy and a girl. That is, a girl who was initially was born and then the boy, right? So Olivia and Adam. So the children are alive, right? And it is then that Nettie also learns another truth, that Alfonso is not actually their father, but their stepfather. So their real father was a store owner, because and he had been very successful. He became very successful, and the white men had killed him because they were very jealous of his success. They had lynched him actually. They had surrounded him and they had lynched him. Like lynched him is killing him, right? Just hitting and beating him, a mob attacking him and killing him, right? So that was a very cruel death that he had to suffer. And he was a store owner, and he was actually their father, but Alfonso was only their stepfather. Now, Alfonso had told Celie and Nettie that he was their real father because he wanted to inherit the house and property that was their mother's. So he made the children believe that he was their real father, because otherwise the property would go to Celie and Nettie, right? So he told them that he made them believe that he was their real father because he wanted the property. And Nettie, when Nettie hears this, she tells Samuel and Corinne that the children are actually her sister's biological children, and she's the children's biological aunt, that is Olivia and Adams. But Corinne refuses to believe Nettie. So Corinne always believes that Samuel and Nettie had some kind of affair in the past. And Corinne is very sick. She dies. And before she dies, just before she dies, she gets reconciled, right? You know, she believes what Nettie tries to say. Initially, she does not believe, right? But before she dies, she gets reconciled to Samuel and Nettie, and she believes what Nettie tries to tell her. And in the meantime, Celie, because Celie gets all these news from the letters, and she goes and visits Alfonso. And Alfonso then confirms that what Nettie told was true, that he was only the stepfather of Celie and Nettie, and he had not killed the children. He had given up the children for adoption. And Celie, after hearing all this, Celie starts to lose some of her faith in God. And Sugar tries to tell her to reimagine God in her own way. So Sugar tries to create a new picture. He says, don't believe the traditional image of God as an old bearded white man. Instead, try to reimagine, reconstruct the image of God. And Sophia, in the meantime, Sophia, who was asked to serve the mayor for 12 years, is released from her servitude 6 months early, right? And one night during dinner, Celie finally, she kind of breaks down. She releases all her pent-up anger and rage and bitterness, and she curses Mr. Dash for his years of abuse, you know. And Sugar then tells that Celie and she are moving to Tennessee, and Squeak says she's also going with them. And they move to Tennessee, a place called Tennessee. Now in Tennessee, Celie starts spending her time designing and sewing individually tailored pairs of pants and quills, right? And she turns this hobby into a business. Multicolored quills she stitches. And Celie returns to Georgia for a visit, and she finds that Mr. Dash has reformed his ways and that Alfonso has died. So Alfonso's house and land are now hers. So she moves there. So Mr. Dash also undergoes a transformation. And what happens is Nettie and Samuel, after Corinne's death, they get married, and they prepare to come back to America from Africa. And Samuel's son Adam, he marries Tashi. Tashi is a native African girl, and according to the African tradition, Tashi has to undergo painful rituals of female circumcision and facial scarring, that is genital mutilation, right? Facial scarring. Now, what does Adam do? Adam is so much in love with Tashi that in solidarity, he also undergoes the same facial scarring ritual, right? So it's very painful, but he wants to identify himself with Tashi. And now Celie has got her own house, and Celie gets reconciled to Mr. Dash. And now they, in their old age, you know, they begin to genuinely enjoy each other's company. Now she's independent financially. She's got her own business of stitching and sewing. So she's independent financially, spiritually, emotionally. Now, initially, Celie used to get very upset when Sugar had affairs with younger men like Grady and all. But now she's no longer bothered by Sugar's passing flings with younger men. So she is independent, she is settled, and she starts to enjoy Mr. Dash's company because they are reconciled. So many years have passed now. Sophia comes back. She remarries Harpo, and now she works in Celie's clothing store. And Nettie finally returns to America with Samuel and the children. And then, you know, Celie is emotionally drained, but she's so happy by the reunion with her sister and her own children that she notes that though Nettie and she are very, very old, and they're quite old now, but she's never felt young. So that's how the story ends. How Nettie comes back and how Celie is reconciled with Mr. Dash, and how Sophia, how she starts her own business, and how in the end she's able, she loved Nettie very much. Both of them loved each other very much. So here we see how they get reconciled, or they come together, and also Adam and Olivia, her own children, how they all get reconciled. So it's a kind of happy ending for Celie, but she had to undergo a lot of turmoil and tensions and trouble and abuses during her initial years. But now it has come to a happy, you can say, a very a kind of very happy close, or a kind of happy ending for. So we see reconciliation everywhere, reconciliation with her husband, Mr. Ash, reconciliation with her sister, with her children, so all coming together as one family unit. So that is the plot of the story. So I will discuss about the rest of the aspects of the story in the next few classes. If you have not read the novel, you must have got an overview. You can read the novel. You can also watch the movie by Steven Spielberg, The Color Purple. You can get it and you can watch that, and you'll get a better idea, because this is the novel that is prescribed. So you need to really go about it in details for detailed study. Okay, I hope it's clear to you. Any questions?